If you were one of the 25 million Americans who took up running during the boom of the 1970s and 80s, stepping onto the start line of your first marathon would have looked very different from today. You wouldn't have had highly engineered maximalist shoes. There would have been no carbohydrate gels in your pockets, no music in your ears, no GPS, probably not even a stopwatch. For most runners, the only feedback available was pretty simple. How fast does this feel? How hard is my breathing? How long can I hold this pace? Running was guided almost entirely by sensation. Today, the picture has changed pretty dramatically. The vast majority of recreational and elite runners, between 73 and 90%, use some form of technology to monitor their training and racing. And modern runners are spoiled for choice in this regard. Watches, wristbands, rings, shoe sensors, smart insoles, even instrumented earbuds can track your pace, the distance you've covered, your heart rate, your cadence, your energy expenditure, even your blood oxygen saturation, your body temperature, and your respiratory rate. In just a few decades, endurance running has moved from something we felt to something we continuously monitor and measure. And that shift raises the central question of this video. When we start outsourcing awareness to technology, what effect, if any, does that have on performance? So the rise of technology in running reflects a broader shift in how endurance training is understood and managed. Historically, monitoring was very simple. The primary tool was the stopwatch. For decades, runners relied on time and distance to judge progress. Training decisions were based almost entirely on what we now call external workload, the mechanical work completed in a session or race. But from the 1970s onwards, the introduction of heart rate monitoring allowed some athletes and coaches to look at something a little bit more meaningful, the body's physiological response to that work. Instead of just measuring how fast they were moving, these runners could now estimate how hard their cardiovascular system was working. This introduced an important distinction that is still central to endurance science today: external load and internal load. Like I said, external load refers to the work performed, your pace, the distance you covered, the elevation climbed, your mechanical power. Internal load reflects the body's response to that work, things like your heart rate, your blood lactate, fatigue, autonomic stress, or perceived exertion. Two runners can complete the same external workload, they can run the same distance at the same pace, but experience different internal strain. And increasingly, decisions are based not just on what the athlete did, but on how their body responded, on that internal load. So throughout the 80s and 90s, running science was evolving with the technologies and products that were becoming available to runners. And the next major shift in the product pipeline came in the early 2000s with the introduction of GPS watches. Devices from companies like Garmin and Polar allowed runners to track pace and distance continuously without needing measured courses or track sessions. Training moved from fixed environments to the open world. And then, very suddenly, wearable technologies went mainstream. The release of the Fitbit Classic in 2009 coincided with much greater interest in wearables among the broader population. And with this increasing popularity, particularly over the past decade, these technologies have evolved into multi-sensor systems that can track a range of digital biomarkers. For example, even a basic smartwatch or fitness tracker can record pace, distance, elevation, and heart rate. And you can buy optical sensors or chest straps that can measure beat-to-beat heart rate variability with excellent accuracy. Devices like rings and watches and even mattresses can now track your sleep and estimate your sleep architecture, how much deep sleep or REM sleep you've been getting. There are foot pods that contain inertial measurement units that can estimate your running power or your ground contact time. These data are then integrated into platform-level composite health or fitness scores, things like Garmin's body battery or training readiness, Polar's nightly recharge, Whoop's daily strain and recovery scores. And most devices these days can estimate your VO2 max values, and these update automatically after runs. Platforms are also increasingly providing suggested workout intensities or recovery days based on your specific biometric data. This would have been science fiction to a runner in the 70s, the way that for many athletes their wearable can create an ongoing personal physiological profile, updated every day, resting heart rate trends, heart rate variability fluctuations, sleep debt, accumulated training load, and predicted fitness changes. In effect, the runner is no longer just recording workouts, they are living inside a personal data state space, one that continuously evaluates their current performance, capacity, and readiness. But it's really important to highlight something at this point. Most of these metrics are not directly measured. They are model-derived estimates based on physiological assumptions, past behavior, and large population data sets. What the runner sees is not raw physiology, but an extrapolated version of it. The watch or ring or band is not measuring your heart rate directly, but rather the reflection of light from the blood vessels underneath your skin, for example. It's not measuring your eye movement or your brain waves or the movement of your chest as you breathe when you are asleep. They're measuring the movement of your wrist, if it's a wrist-worn sensor, and making inferences based on that. Now, an awful lot of effort has gone into the development of the algorithms that spit out a heart rate value, for example, based on a photoplethysmography sensor's readings, but that doesn't mean it's always accurate. Even still, for the endurance athlete, the introduction of these various biosensing technologies has meant that training isn't really guided just by how the effort feels in the moment or in the hours and days after, but by how the wearable system predicts the body is responding. Because wearable devices don't just measure performance, they influence it. In control systems engineering, this type of process is known as a closed-loop system. Performance is measured, the result is compared with the target, feedback is provided, and behavior is adjusted. This same loop now operates within endurance training, often in real time. A runner might check their watch to see that their pace is too fast. They might slow down. Their heart rate rises above a prescribed zone. They ease off. A recovery score might indicate high fatigue, so they shorten the session they had planned or they skip it entirely. Performance is not regulated solely by internal perception, it's being continuously adjusted by external feedback. But all of this is just speculation. What does the research actually show? Well, first off, experimental studies that have compared the performance of athletes with and without the influence of feedback provided by wearables tend to come in three types. Studies in which data is either visible or hidden from the athlete, studies where the athlete is either given accurate or distorted information, and then studies where there are known versus unknown race endpoints. And the results are really surprising in a lot of ways, but not always consistent. First, it turns out that external feedback does not consistently improve overall performance. For example, in trained athletes, so those who train regularly and who have the experience of having trained or competed in the activity that was tested, the time taken to finish the task was often unchanged whether detailed performance metrics were visible to them or not. But what did change was how the effort was distributed. With full feedback, the athletes were more likely to produce structured pacing patterns, like a constant pace in the middle of a bout with a pronounced end spurt. Without feedback, effort seems to shift towards the middle of the exercise bout or become more conservative early on. So feedback tends to change the shape of pacing rather than the final outcome, at least in terms of finish time. One piece of information does seem to be especially important though, knowing how much work remains. When the amount of distance that is left to run or the remaining time left in the activity is hidden, athletes typically adopt a more cautious strategy. They choose lower power outputs or slower speeds, and overall performance tends to decline. Interestingly though, the athlete's perceived exertion often follows a similar trajectory in both conditions. So athletes don't necessarily feel that the effort is easier, even though they're working less hard to conserve energy for the unknown. They just regulate more conservatively when uncertainty about the endpoint is high. And that fits with the contemporary models of pacing that we've talked about in other videos, where effort is regulated not just by how the body feels, but by how those sensations and feelings are interpreted relative to what lies ahead. Now, there is some evidence that feedback can also improve performance, but the effects are small and context dependent. In short, high-intensity time trials, for example, performance has been shown to sometimes improve when the athlete is given a slightly more demanding target. For example, racing against a virtual competitor set about 2% faster than their previous best. The key to this effect seems to be credibility. Small, believable or achievable challenges can lead athletes to access a slightly higher sustainable output, but larger or unrealistic targets usually produce no benefit, which would suggest that pacing regulation quickly compensates to protect against excessive fatigue. Again, the effect is not dramatic, typically in the order of 1 to 2%, but perceived exertion seems to stay the same in both the faster and slower conditions. And then, when it comes to the amount of feedback, studies comparing single versus multiple performance metrics have shown that experienced athletes can actually perform worse when they are forced to monitor too many variables simultaneously. The likely explanation here is attentional load. Instead of regulating effort smoothly, the athlete is dividing attention between multiple targets: pace, heart rate, power, cadence, each with its own fluctuations, all while actually having to run the race or cycle the course. So in this context, the device becomes less of a guide and more of a cognitive burden. So how to make sense of all of this? Well, probably the most important takeaway is this. Experienced endurance athletes rely heavily on internal pacing models. When feedback is removed, performance often drops initially, but across repeated trials, athletes quickly recalibrate and recover similar performance levels. This would suggest that external devices can be helpful, but are not essential. The underlying regulatory system, the master controller, remains internal. The instrumented runner may become more informed, but less embodied, and this raises a follow-on question for endurance training more generally. Is the goal to replace internal judgment with external control, or to use technology in a way that strengthens the athlete's own perceptual skills? Because in the latter stages of a marathon, when fatigue, heat, and glycogen depletion begin to accumulate, the most reliable signal is often still the oldest one: how the effort actually feels. In other words, your rating of perceived exertion, or PE. So if wearable technology changes how athletes regulate effort, what effect do wearables have in the competitive environment? In endurance sport, pacing is one of the strongest determinants of performance. Small errors in early intensity can accelerate glycogen depletion, increase thermal strain, and lead to substantial performance loss later in an event. Traditionally, effective pacing depended on experience and a well-developed sense of effort. But today, pacing can be externally stabilized. Some athletes now begin a marathon with a plan that has been algorithmically optimized based on predicted finishing time, environmental conditions, and course demands. In effect, part of the decision-making process is transformed from the athlete to the model. The upshot is that as the monitoring system becomes more predictive, the boundary between measurement and performance support begins to blur. And this has led to increasing discussion around what is sometimes referred to as digital doping. The performance advantages arising from advanced monitoring, predictive modeling, and real-time optimization. Think about it. Unlike traditional coaching, these systems can provide continuous, moment-to-moment guidance during competition. They can generate personalized predictions for your finish times from a 5K to a marathon. The central issue then is whether these tools, specifically algorithmically derived personalized pacing strategies, can improve performance, and whether unequal access to advanced data systems creates a competitive imbalance, particularly for the elites, the professional athletes. If two athletes have identical physiological capacity, but one has real-time predictive pacing and environmental modeling, are they competing under the same conditions? But this also skirts an important counterpoint, one that is often overlooked. The assumption here is that the data your wearable is giving you is actually meaningful. The reality is that while wearable data often appears to be precise and objective, its accuracy, particularly when it comes to those measures of internal training load, is variable. As I said earlier, many commonly used metrics are not directly measured, but estimated using proprietary algorithms based on indirect signals and population models. For example, we have shown in our research how wrist-based optical heart rate sensing during running can show errors of 5 to 15 beats per minute, particularly at higher intensities or under conditions of motion artifact or reduced skin perfusion. We've also shown how wearable-derived VO2 max values, which are predicted based on heart rate and running speed, typically show standard errors of around 5 to 10% compared with laboratory measurements. All of this research highlights a really important scientific distinction. Precision is not the same as validity. A device may produce consistent numbers, but those numbers may not accurately represent the physiological variable they claim to measure. There's also substantial variability between devices and platforms, and most commercial algorithms operate as proprietary black boxes with limited transparency regarding how metrics like readiness, recovery, or training status are calculated. For the athlete, this creates a subtle paradox. Training and racing decisions are increasingly guided by data, but the physiological truth behind those data, particularly when it relates to internal training load, is often uncertain. And as reliance on these systems increases, the question shifts again. How will this evolve in the generations of athletes to come? If current wearable technology focuses on monitoring training and recovery, the next generation of systems is moving towards something more ambitious: continuous physiological tracking, prediction, and increasingly automation. Several emerging technologies are already beginning to appear in endurance sport. Continuous glucose monitors allow athletes to track real-time changes in blood glucose during training and competition. Ingestible temperature sensors can transmit core body temperature data, helping to manage heat strain during prolonged exercise. Wearable sweat sensors are being developed to estimate fluid and electrolyte loss. And advances in machine learning are allowing training platforms to analyze large volumes of personal data, identifying patterns in performance, fatigue and injury risk, and adaptation. The long-term goal of many of these systems is personalized optimization, not just tracking what the athlete has done, but predicting what they should do next. Some researchers and technology companies are now even exploring the concept of a digital twin, a computational model of an individual athlete that simulates how their body is likely to respond to different training loads, environmental conditions, or race strategies. In this vision of endurance sport, training plans and pacing strategies are no longer designed primarily by coaches or even by the athletes themselves. They are generated, adjusted, and refined continuously by algorithms. Assuming that these data are accurate, the potential benefits are clear. More precise training loads, earlier detection of excessive fatigue, reduced injury risk, more accurate pacing and fueling strategies. But as the technology becomes more predictive and more directive, the role of the athlete begins to change. Decision-making moves gradually from human judgment to system recommendation, and eventually to system control. At that point, the question is not how much data we can collect. It becomes about whether we are allowing this data to take over and what we're willing to hand over. And that brings us back to the central question for this topic. If two runners have the same physiology, but one is guided continuously by predictive algorithms, optimization models, and real-time feedback, are they competing equally? More broadly, at what point does technology stop supporting the athlete and start replacing that athlete's own judgment? Because endurance performance is always dependent uniquely on human skill, the ability to interpret effort, to manage discomfort, to make decisions under fatigue and under uncertainty. The future of endurance sport may involve more data than ever before, but the challenge for athletes, coaches, and scientists will be deciding how to use that data without losing something more fundamental, the ability to listen to the body that evolution built to run.